Hey, Mike, good to see you. How are you?
Good. There we go.
You've got the setting sun, I think, back behind you.
Well, yeah, we just actually yesterday moved into our new house in Sydney,
Oh,
Australia,
okay.
which is in Dover Heights. It's up on a hill overlooking the harbor. It's gorgeous, but uh, it's very bright, and I'm trying to figure out where to put everything. So hopefully you can see me.
Yeah, well, congratulations. That's terrific.
Thanks.
So this is morning for you then.
Yes, yeah,
Okay, so that is the rising sun behind you.
it is indeed. Yeah, it's
Excellent, good.
we're heading
All
into
right.
summer actually, just to rub it
Yeah,
in.
yeah. My sister lives in Sydney. They
Ah,
live somewhere right down by the water. I don't know the neighborhood there, but
yeah, there's a lot of places near the water in Sydney. It's one of the nice things.
yeah, yeah. It's a beautiful city.
Yeah.
All right, we're 3 minutes after, so we'll go ahead and get it kicked off. Um, so let me begin by saying welcome this evening. This is a speaker series sponsored by the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University. Our guest tonight is Mike Green. He's going to be talking to us about the line of advantage, Japan's grand strategy in the era of Abe Shinzo. Michael J. Green is the Director of Asian Studies and Chair in Modern and Contemporary Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, as well as a Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He has served at senior levels of the National Security Council, and his books include By More Than Providence, Grand Strategy and American Power in the Asia Pacific since 1783, which is a great tour de force of the U.S. Long-run footprint in the region. And he has a new book out that he's going to be talking to us tonight, and that is this line of advantage. So all about the logic and I think in some ways I don't want to steal the thunder, but I think admirable grand strategy that Mike sees Japan having embarked on under Abe Shinzo. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Mike. We've got about an hour altogether for this, so if you wanted to talk, and then we'll open up for questions towards the end.
Great. I'm guessing because these are Scowcroft fellows, they're not shy. So I'll leave time for questions and discussion, and looking forward to that. I'm in Sydney. I'm on leave from Georgetown. I've moved here to take over a think tank, one of the three think tanks that are well known in Australia, called the U.S. Studies Center, which mainly focuses on the U.S.-Australia alliance. But it's very, very interesting being in Australia and looking at Asia and the world upside down. And one of the things I knew, but I've really, in a palpable way experienced is how close Australia and Japan have become. And we did a survey at the center in Sydney of Americans and Australians and Japanese publics. And one question we asked was, of Australians, would a security treaty with Japan make Australia more secure? And 75% said yes. As you probably know, the only security treaty Japan actually has is with the United States. Prime Minister Kishida and Prime Minister Albanese met last week in Perth, Western Australia, and signed a security declaration, sort of agreeing to cooperate on a whole range of areas, including consulting on contingencies in Asia. But it was not ratified by Parliament. Our security treaty with Japan was ratified by Parliament, and in Article 5, we agreed to defend Japan. So it's not the same as the U.S.-Japan security treaty, but it's the most important security relationship for both sides. And it tells you it's a different way to think about how influential Japan has become in the strategic dynamics in this region. As Chinese power grows, and as many countries, not all, but many countries grow deeply concerned about Chinese intentions. Japan has agency. In social science, we use the term agency. Use it in a lot of behavioral sciences. Agency is the ability of a person or a country to shape events. International relations theorists, tend to prefer focusing on structure. Those are the two big things in any social science or international relations and analytical effort. How much of the things we are seeing are structure, and how much are agency? How much of what we're seeing in US-China relations or Japan's new role is the result of shifting power? The Chinese economy, when Abe, just before Abe came to power in 2012 for the second time, the Chinese economy was number 3 in the world. Now it's number 2 in the world. At that time, the Chinese Navy and the Japanese Navy were about the same size. Now China's Navy is 3 times, maybe 4 times Japan's. It's 4 times the size of our Pacific Fleet, roughly the size of the overall US Navy. So that's a huge shift in the structure of international relations, of the distribution of power.
And importantly, China's number 3 past number 2, Japan. Right?
That's right. So you look at structure and you say, man, this is a huge change. And if you've studied the hardcore structural realists, as they're called, the people who really focus on structure, and maybe Professor Norris has studied with them, I don't know, but people like John Mearsheimer at the University of Chicago, they pretty much predict there will be a war with China. Like, structure determines everything, except that it doesn't. It doesn't. There's contingency, things happen. Look at how COVID has started to slow the Chinese economy. Most economists no longer think China will surpass the US in nominal GDP, in economic growth, because of all the temporary restrictions from COVID, but really the longer term impact of Xi Jinping focusing on military power and national security rather than innovation and creativity in the economy. So there's contingency, but the real factor is agency. People can make a difference. And that's why Abe is so interesting, because if you just looked at structure, you'd say, as Professor Norris pointed out, China surpassed Japan. Japan's on demographics are not good. It's a rapidly aging society. Certainly in the 90s and right up until Abe's time, a lot of people were writing Japan off, looking at the structure of power and economics. In fact, there was a survey in 2012, just before Abe came to power, by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. They do really interesting surveys every few years of the American views of the world. And they asked the question, in the future, should the US be working more with China or with Japan in Asia? And Japan won barely, but the question they've had asked, and every year China grew up, and the expectation was the next time they asked, a majority of Americans would say we should work with China, because that's where the money is, that's where the economic growth is, just no getting around it. And indeed, at that time, the Obama administration was considering a proposal from Beijing, from Xi Jinping, the new leader in China, who came on the scene as Abe did, for what he called a Shinjin Daguo Wanshi, a new model of great power relations, Shingata Taikoku Kanke in Japanese, new model of great power relations. The Chinese are brilliant at the 4 and 6 character Chinese character phrases. And so new model, great power relations, Kanke, Wanshi. So that's 6 characters. And the first one, new model, sounds cool. What they meant was, let's avoid the old model, the structural realists model, where rising power is like a fight with the status quo powers. Graham Allison at Harvard calls it the Thucydides trap. A lot of people say he's got his ancient history wrong, but the idea that in the Peloponnesian Wars, Greece and Athens fought because power shifted and they were jealous of each other, and that's just what happens, structural factors. So new model, let's avoid the old model of rising powers, of great power relations. And what the Chinese meant by great power was, in the new distribution of power in Asia and the world, there's basically 3 great powers in the Chinese telling, or 3.5. One is obviously China. Thank you very much. The other is the United States. The third, conveniently for China, was Russia. And then Europe was a separate pole or separate power. But the Chinese view of Europe was it was easily divided and manipulated. So this was a Chinese formula saying, let's avoid conflict based on your admission or your recognition in the United States that we are in a world of multipolarity globally. So globally, it's the US, Russia, China, maybe Europe. But within the Asia Pacific, or Indo-Pacific as we now call it, it's bipolar. It's the US and China, the 2 big kids on the block, and everybody else is irrelevant. So, and that was literally how the Chinese scholars and diplomats describe this new model of great. But we will avoid a war with the U.S. and the U.S. will avoid war with China because the U.S. will accommodate us in this new model of relations based on a recognition that Asia is U.S., China, and everyone else is irrelevant, which means by implication, U.S. support for Taiwan, U.S. support for Japan's territorial disputes with China, U.S. support for human rights and democracy. That's not how great powers avoid conflict. You should compromise on all of that. Basically, the fine print was sell out your allies, cut deals with China to avoid conflict. And I can tell you, because I spoke with them, one of the fun things about being in government is if you've been in government as I have, you get called in by, cabinet members or, chief of the Air Force or whatever to give 2 hours of wisdom, and then you can leave and go play tennis. You don't have to stay in government and like work all night. So I in this period met with Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, with John Kerry when he was Secretary, and others. And the Obama administration was really divided. Half of them, particularly Hillary, their attitude was, oh, we're with China and sell out our allies. Others, John Kerry, for example, said, this is brilliant. This is what we need to do. So there was real division. And as I mentioned in those surveys, there was division in the American public. American public was roughly split, slightly more for Japan, about where our future was. At the time, the Japanese government, before Abe came to power, was on its 6th prime minister in 6 years. So constant political churn and Chinese ships surrounding the Senkaku Islands, which Japan controls, but China claims, called Jiaoyu in Chinese, just getting bullied and kicked around in Asia, new prime minister every year. President Obama referred to one of them, Hatsuyama, as loopy. He was so lost and confused. So this is where agency matters.
Mike, this is also in the aftermath of the financial crisis in the 2008
yes,
financial
so
crisis.
the financial
there was
crisis,
this idea of a G2 too. That
the financial crisis was a huge factor. The Chinese leadership assumed that the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, when most of you might have been in grade school, that was an indication of American decline. So this is where agency matters. Abe came to power for the second time. He was prime minister in 2006 and 2007. Before that, he had been a chief lieutenant to Prime Minister Koizumi of Japan. And Koizumi was very close to George W. Bush. And so when I was in the White House on the NSC staff, and I speak Japanese, I was in constant telephone and this was pre-Zoom, constant telephone and also in-person contact coordinating on North Korea policy, war on terror, Taiwan with Abe. So I got to know him quite well. When he became prime minister and succeeded Koizumi in 2006 and 2007, it was a disaster. He wasn't ready, he was too young, he was too inexperienced, he had health problems. He nursed his health, he studied, a little bit like Winston Churchill in the wilderness years, warning about the growing threat from China, gathering officials who were sympathetic around him, very similar to Churchill, if you know the sort of the years of Churchill being out of power before 1940. And the LDP, the ruling party, brought him back. And they brought him back because he had a strategy. He was decisive, and frankly, this is where agency matters. Xi Jinping made Abe. Xi Jinping's aggressive stance made a hawkish national security leader like Abe possible. So when Abe came to power, he faced, going back to international relations terms, he faced several options to deal with the rising China and the structural challenges he faced. So in international relations theory, governments, leaders have kind of three options when their adversary is growing so powerful so quickly in relative terms. So one is called bandwagoning, which is basically shifting sides. Join the bandwagon, join Team China. Japan would say, you're the future, we're with you. We're not going to contest your hegemony in Asia. Some countries do that very effectively. Thailand has survived as an independent entity for hundreds of years by very effectively bandwagoning at just the right moment. Japan was never going to do that. Some scholars predicted Japan would do that. I never believed it. Japan has been refusing Chinese hegemony since the 7th century, when the sun god, dipped her spear in the Pacific Ocean and created the Japanese archipelago and created the Japanese imperial line, which was an imperial line, not a king, not a prince, not a Raj, but an imperial line like China, the only one in Asia, to say we may be a small island country compared to China, but civilizationally, we're not taking second place. So Japan has been competing with China since before, America was a blip in the Vikings' eye or something. So long before our history. And when Abe came to CSIS, I hosted him at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he opened his speech by saying Japan is not now and will never be a tier 2 power. So very clearly signaling internally and abroad, Japan was not, sorry, somebody's mic just went on. Japan was not going to accept Chinese hegemony in Asia. Now, that didn't mean that Abe intended to contain China. He just was not going to allow Chinese hegemony if he could help it. He wanted a productive relationship with China, but not Chinese suzerainty and dominance. The Chinese went at him like crazy. Chinese ambassadors around the world were ordered to write articles in the Washington Post, in the Telegraph in London, attacking Abe as a dangerous revisionist. The Chinese ambassador in London in 2013 wrote an article comparing Abe to Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter, this dangerous, evil, right-wing revisionist. The interesting thing is when Abe was killed, almost 10 years later, the Chinese government put out a statement acknowledging that Abe had actually strengthened Japan-China relations. So it's very important to point out Abe was not trying to cut off or contain China. He was trying to reset relations and disabuse China of the idea it could just roll past Japan to assert hegemony in Asia. And I mention that because in the US strategy right now, because we have caught up and we are now all about competing with China, the Biden administration, before that, the Trump administration, have not answered the question, how does this end? How does this end? Where does competition go? Does China collapse? Abe from the beginning had it as his goal not to contain or undercut China, not to go for regime change, but to stabilize relations and get respect for Japan and respect for the international liberal order. So he rolled out bandwagoning. It was about competing. So when you compete, there are two options that theorists point to. One is called internal balancing, and the other is external balancing. Internal balancing basically means you restore your leverage, your balance of power by building up your power to deter, to compel, to dissuade, to stop the other guy from bullying you. It's kind of like you get in a bar fight and go get a knife or a gun. So the easiest and fastest way to restore internal balancing would have been nuclear weapons, which is North Korea's approach. It's declining, collapsing as an economy. Nuclear weapons. Nobody messes with you if you have nuclear weapons. Japan's public, because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, consistently 70–80% say never under any circumstances do they want nuclear weapons. And if Japan developed nuclear weapons, it would be isolated. And Abe's whole strategy was not about isolating Japan, but about building relationships. So that's out. The other way you can internally balance is to build up your economy. And Abe knew this. I had lunch with him in 2013, and he said 70% of his time was on the economy. Japan's economy has been sluggish since the 90s. Abe did things to quickly add growth. He changed policies to bring women into the workforce more. Almost 3 million women in the space of 3 or 4 years. Huge opportunities for women. We can talk about it in the Q&A. Not perfect. There are a lot of barriers to women, but it was a huge surge of women in the workforce. And if you've got a declining population and you need to increase productivity, you got to empower the half of your population that's smart, ready, and able, but not given opportunities. They were given more opportunities, not as much as the US or Europe, for reasons we can discuss, some structural, some cultural, but that added growth. He reformed the tourism industry, tripled Japanese tourism in just a few years, changed the stock market. He squeezed more growth out of the Japanese economy, not a lot. To do a lot, he would have had to probably radically restructure the economy. Big, opening and reform, but that was politically tough, so he didn't go there. The other way you can internally balance is by increasing defense spending. He increased defense spending after over a decade of decline at a time when China was growing 10 to 20% a year. Japan was declining by that much in its procurement. So he increased defense spending modestly. And interestingly now, Japan's defense spending has been about depending on how you count by NATO standards, 1.26% of GDP. There's a big move in Abe's name as his legacy to move to 2% of GDP, almost doubling. But the really significant internal balancing that Abe did was organizational. So there's quantitative internal balancing where you get more stuff, whether it's economic growth, nuclear weapons, missiles. But there's also something called qualitative internal balancing. Qualitative is how you organize yourself to make the most of what you've got for your strategy. And Abe created a centralized national security state. He established Japan's first real national security council like we have in the US. He broke down stovepipes. He changed the role of the cabinet and the prime minister. So it was very presidential. He gave orders, we're going to compete with China. Therefore, Navy and Coast Guard, stop bickering with each other. You will work together to defend our waters, to give one example. Trade ministry, foreign ministry, finance ministry, you will work together to develop technologies and protect our technology. So he really created, almost like the US at the beginning of the Cold War, or the beginning of World War II, or the beginning of World War I, he created a national security state to get, if you have fewer relative resources, how do you get more out of them? By directing how they're used more centrally and more efficiently. So that's internal balancing. He didn't do bandwagoning, not trying to contain China, but not going to submit to Chinese hegemony. He did some internal balancing. I think, and I argue in my book, that the most significant thing he did, which in some ways is the easiest, is external balancing. The other side's getting more powerful. You don't have as many things to counter. You're not going to bandwagon. So what do? You make friends. You say to China, have you met my 6-foot friend America here? Have you met my 5'5" but tough as nails friend Australia over there? Have you noticed that I've met with every ASEAN leader, which Abe did in his first 6 months? Have you noticed that we're signing big trade agreements with Europe, that I'm attending NATO summits? So that's external balancing, building, networking. In the post-war period, the US alliance system in Asia was very bilateral. For a variety of reasons, we didn't do what we did in Europe. We didn't create a NATO, one collective security organization, which includes everybody from Norway to Turkey, all on one team. We couldn't do that in Asia because everyone still hated each other. Geographically, they're spread out in different ways. And it became hard after the Cold War because all of our allies and partners in Asia trade more with China than they do with us. We invest more than China does, and they invest more in us than they do in China, but trade is a lot. And so hard to create a collective security organization. And we've always had these bilateral alliances, US-Japan alliance at the center, ANZUS with Australia and New Zealand, US-Korea, so forth. Abe's strategy was to start networking and creating something closer to collective security. So he proposed the Quad, US, Japan, Australia, India Quad, aligning the big maritime powers to defend the rules and the maritime space from Chinese hegemony. But he didn't just sort of counter China, he invested in Asia. As China was building up its Belt and Road Initiative, offering financing of infrastructure, but with dubious terms sometimes, and often to benefit Chinese military installations, although sometimes also to help development. And there was a lot of suspicion about Belt and Road. Abe announced what he called the free and open Indo-Pacific, which was a massive Japanese infrastructure financing scheme, more money than China was offering, better terms throughout Southeast Asia and South Asia. And in public opinion polls and elite surveys in Southeast Asia and South Asia, Japan is, by a very wide margin, the most trusted country in the world. It's amazing. This is the country that invaded and occupied them with the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But today, Japan is by far, in Australia, India, every country in Southeast Asia, everywhere except Korea and China, the most trusted country. So Abe built on that, and then the other thing Abe did was, when the Trump administration started retreating from big agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the biggest trade agreement across the Pacific that would have locked the U.S. and 11 Asian economies together to basically have a huge market bigger than China's, and start saying, these are the rules. And Trump just pulled out. And then Biden said he wasn't coming in. Well, Abe stepped up and resuscitated TPP and kept it alive. And the Japanese continue saying, we're going to hold a seat at the table for you, America, until you get off of your drunken isolationist, crazy protectionist binge. So the Lowy Institute, another think tank in Australia, which surveys Asia every year, declared in 2019 that under Abe, Japan had become, and this is a bit of a slap at the US, but Japan had become the leader of the free world in Asia, of the liberal order in Asia, because the US was just retreating on diplomacy and economic things. And also in 2019, the Chicago survey I mentioned, where Americans were divided whether we should work more with Japan or with China, over 2/3 of Americans said work with Japan, not China. And a lot of that was Xi Jinping scaring people, but a lot of it was Abe showing that Japan could build relationships with Australia and India, could invest in Southeast Asia, could shore up the system that America built, while the US got a little distracted with their own politics. But here's the last thing in an external balancing. Abe's not trying to create a system without the US. He's trying to lock the US in. When he was prime minister in 2014 and 15, Abe changed through 110 hours of diet debate and protests and everything else, changed how Japan interprets its post-war pacifist constitution. Article 9, which Americans wrote, said Japan renounces the right of war to resolve international disputes. It's the so-called peace clause. And the Japanese government, for 70 years, interpreted that as meaning they cannot engage in collective, what they call collective self-defense. Collective defense like NATO. Japan can't, the US-Japan Security Treaty means one to Australia's defense. And the Japanese people wanted to keep that interpretation because they didn't want to get pulled into a war again. They didn't want to go to Vietnam. They didn't want to get pulled into a war in the Middle East. They wanted to focus on economic recovery and just have an alibi, have an excuse to say to the Americans or the Australians or the Koreans, we'd love to help you with your little war in Vietnam or Iraq or whatever, but we can't because the Constitution, which you Americans wrote, says we don't do collective defense or collective self-defense, as the Japanese call it. We only can defend ourselves. That's pretty convenient if you're a Japanese government that's trying to focus on economic recovery and not get distracted by war and conflict and wants to keep as many markets open for yourself and frankly be a bit mercantilist. It's a liability now. When Chinese ships are circumnavigating Japan, when North Korea can now hit Japan with hundreds of missiles, including with nuclear warheads probably, you don't need an alibi to keep the Americans away from you. You need a way to make sure the Americans are locked in. And so Abe changed that interpretation to allow collective defense with the US, with Australia, with India, that if, they caveated it in the legislation, they said it has to be a matter of national survival. But if Japan's national survival is at stake, and of course, the Japanese prime minister will decide what that means, Japan can send forces. Japanese ships and American ships can defend the South China Sea together. If Australian ships are being attacked, Japanese jets can come to the rescue. This is completely new for Japan. And it's in some ways the biggest change of all that Abe has made. And so the bottom line is Abe is known as a nationalist. He's known as a revisionist, but he has done more than any leader in the world to define how you compete with China, which is standing up but not containing, to define how you reinforce the liberal order at a time when America's a bit wobbly, which is not doing what the Europeans do and sort of pushing America away, but pulling America in more, and then working with other powers like Australia and India to really pull it together. So it was a masterful strategy that really defined our strategy. Trump and Biden both embraced Abe's idea for the Quad. They both embraced the free and open Indo-Pacific. They both saw Abe first, or in Biden's case, his successor, Suga first, Japanese Prime Minister first before anyone else. Abe has shaped how the US approaches the region in significant ways. There's a lot Abe did wrong. We can go into that. He was assassinated by a man who was upset that his mother was pulled into a unification church cult in Japan that supported Abe's faction of the LDP since the 1960s. He did not reconcile with Korea. That was the piece of his strategy that never really came together. So there are things to criticize, but I argued, and to my pleasant surprise, very few people disagreed, that he was probably the most important world leader in defining this new era of competition with China and shaping how the rest of us think about it. So with that, happy to take questions, and I'll turn it over to you, to lead us through however you want to do it.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I mean, that was, I think, very enlightening, a nice tour through. I think you raised some really good facts, I think, for people to chew on, and some interesting observations as you connected the dots. So if you have questions for Michael Green, send them to me on the chat via the chat function. You can direct message them to me, and I'll add you into the list. So the first question, of course, is Abe's strategy. His grand strategy is one that is definitely ambitious. It's positive. There's a vision there. There's a clear logic at play. And I think the big question has always been the extent to which it can be supported economically, and whether that foundation is there. And you addressed that. There's things that he did on the economic side. So the question is, does the economic foundations underpinning the strategy, in your opinion, are they there? And if they're not, or if there still needs to be more done to kind of realize that full ambition of the grand strategy, when would you start to see that inability to support the vision begin to take effect? And what would sort of be the first cracks you might start seeing in the vision? If the vision has to kind of come back into the limitations of the economic capabilities, what would you see as kind of the leading indicators of that happening? Because I agree with you. I think he set out a very ambitious vision, and the economy, he tried to help it, but he didn't really ever quite get that third arrow where he wanted it, and it never quite had those deep structural reforms maybe that he had hoped for. So in the absence of those, if you assume that those are they're just tough to do in the Japanese context, where might that disconnect begin to sort of create a little bit of a rub on that strategic vision?
So it's a really important question, but just for a little bit of context, Japan's share of the global economy right now is about the same size as Britain's share was at the height of the British Empire. And it's about 3 or 4 times higher than Japan's share of global economy when Japan was at the height of its military power in 1941, 42, the Great East Asian. It was a different Japan. But I just mentioned that because size matters, the size of the economy matters, but with smart strategy, with strong alliances, countries can punch well above their weight, which is, of course, the essence of what Abe has been trying, or was trying to do. There's probably a dozen things Japan has to do to get out of, it has a mature and therefore slightly sluggish economic growth pattern. There are pockets of Japan. I just was in Tokyo for the first time since COVID a week ago. Tokyo is just booming. It's unbelievable. I think the growth rate in Tokyo must be 7%. I mean, it's just sparkling and growing, and cranes everywhere, and new, just fantastic urban centers and malls. But you go out into rural Japan, it hasn't grown in 20 years. And then you look at some companies, Tokyo Electron. I had dinner with the president of Tokyo Electron. Americans have never heard of Tokyo Electron, but it's one of the top 2 manufacturers of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. Semiconductors are the future, everyone's talking about them. Who makes the machines that build semiconductors? Japan, Korea, and Holland. And Japan's growing the fastest. Very high-tech precision lithography and all the stuff I don't understand because I was a history major. So Japan has nanotechnology, robotics. Japan has pockets of absolute world-class excellence. But a lot of Japanese companies that used to be iconic, like Sony and Toshiba, are on the ropes. So very uneven, but pockets of strength. The companies in Japan that are successful are global. They're getting most of their growth outside of Japan. A lot of that was from China. They're all now looking at other markets, the US, interestingly, Europe, South and Southeast Asia, because the China market's problematic. Too big to escape from, but you can't escape without major loss, but staying is risky. And so they're hedging. They're starting to expand in Vietnam and India and so forth, and Arizona and Wisconsin. The areas where Japan could get more economic growth. So there's about 12 or so, I'd say. I'm not going to go through all of them. Abe did some. Women's empowerment. When Abe came to power, the OECD, the economic grouping, argued that if Japan had the same level of women's participation in the workforce as the OECD average, its productivity would increase many-fold. Japan brought, under Abe, women into the workforce, but then they started hitting obstacles. Still some discrimination, not enough infrastructure for daycare. So there's more that can be done on women's empowerment to increase productivity. Japanese productivity is declining, not increasing, despite initial gains in productivity from women coming into the workforce. Japan is not very digitally friendly. If you travel to Japan, Australia is amazing. The apps and the online ability to get your driver's license, to do all that stuff, is just lightning speed compared to the US. I've been very impressed. Japan's the opposite from the US. This is a culture, and this is cultural, where face-to-face communication, written documents, your hanko, your stamp, are critical signs of trust in business and government. The idea in Japanese culture of trusting a digital platform is very hard. So Kono Taro, who's been a contender for prime minister, was a Georgetown University grad, has been pushing for Japan to have a more digital economy. So that would make a huge difference moving into the future of digital economy. So those are some of the things Japan can do to spur more growth. Immigration's a big one. When you have a declining economy, a declining demographic, you get more immigrants. Empower women, get more immigrants. Actually, Japan has a huge increase in immigrants. You go to a 7-Eleven in Japan, and there's not a Japanese employee in there. They're Brazilian, Canadian, Israeli, Chinese, Taiwanese, but they're all on short-term visas. And if you want to build technological talent and high-end engineers and so forth, you need to have a visa system that allows families to come. And so Japan has lots and lots of visas for short-term workers to fill the gaps because of the demographic picture. They need to take the next step to actually making it possible for people to immigrate to Japan. And that means you need more English language, because not everyone's going to come speaking Japanese. These are cultural things. I think they're going to happen personally. I think they're going to happen. It's amazing that, getting back to structure, it's amazing how structural changes, fear of China, has changed culture in a lot of countries. In the United States, we just passed in Congress the so-called Chips and Science Act to invest over $50 billion from the US government in semiconductor manufacturing. This is called industrial policy. Republicans used to hate industrial policy, keep the government out of the market. The main author of this CHIPS Act was Todd Young, a Reagan Republican from Indiana. So culture changes when you face a challenge. And I think Japan's culture changed a lot with Abe on defense spending and alliances and collective defense. And I think you're going to see more changes on issues. You saw them with women. I think you're going to see changes in views of immigration. That will help to ameliorate the demographic picture. And it is also, finally, to conclude, worth remembering that China's demographic picture is now entering an equally dire phase. But China doesn't have the social safety network that Japan has. So that's going to be a challenge. So yeah, it's a really good question. There are ways out of it. Japan's going to have to increase taxes to pay for defense spending. There's not enough revenue from the current economy. So it does shape the strategy, but I think there are ways, and the culture will change so that Abe's strategy can continue. It's not guaranteed, but I would bet on it.
Okay. And there's another question here. Can you elaborate on the geostrategic title of your book? What is the line of advantage? And what did Asotaro mean when he said, China is mirroring Japan's mistake in the last century, only this time it is a continental power engaged in the folly of seeking maritime conquest?
So line of advantage in Japanese Ryekisen was a concept introduced in the Meiji period in the 1880s and 90s by Yamagata Aritomo, who was one of the Meiji leaders. And Yamagata, created Japan's national army, really was the most important of the reforming leaders as Japan emerged in the world in creating national institutions and national strategy, and looking at Japan's future, because from 1604 to 1853, Japan was closed to the world, the so-called closed state. Sakokujira in Japanese, until Commodore Perry and the black ships of the US Navy arrived in Edo Bay to open Japan up. And so in the 1880s and 90s, Japan was modernizing, but when it was coming out of its civil war and out of the Meiji Restoration and starting to look around the world and around Asia. And Yamagata said, major countries in the world, and Japan is now emerging in a competitive world of imperial powers and the Russians, the British, the Americans, the Germans. He said major powers have their line of defense, which is their border, but they also have to think about their line of advantage. Where do they want to have influence to keep threats far away, to make sure they have markets? And he was arguing that as Russia expanded on continental Asia because of Chinese weakness, Japan needed to decide where is its line of advantage. And Yamagata said it's certainly the Korean Peninsula, maybe it's Manchuria. And so when I chose that title, it was a bit controversial, because for Japanese historians, that line of advantage idea was what led to Japan's imperialism and annexation of Korea and annexation of Manchuria and war with China. And so many Japanese historians sort of historically viewed that as a problematic term. But I consulted, and I thought, gosh, maybe that's too spicy. But I consulted with a number of Japanese leading historians. I said, what do you think? And they said, it's a little, we wouldn't do it, but you're an American, you should do it. Because that's essentially what Abe is talking about. Japan can't just defend itself. It has to shape the regional order. It has to partner with other countries. It has to think of its line of advantage. How does it make sure that while Japan coexists with China, China doesn't have hegemony and sort of a new kind of imperialism over Southeast Asia or the Pacific Islands or the South China Sea? Where is that line of advantage? And Abe expanded that and expanded the Japanese thinking about tools. But as I pointed out very carefully in the book, two important caveats. One is the tools are very, very different from pre-war Japan. It's mostly infrastructure financing, diplomacy, alliances, not military expansion. And secondly, at the time Yamagata was arguing that, Japan was at a crossroads, and people often forget this historical episode. It was not foreordained that Japan would be a militarist imperial power. There were strategists, and I have a whole chapter in the book about them, who were arguing that Japan's future in the 1870s and 80s, that Japan's future was as a maritime power, aligned with Britain and America, upholding the maritime order, not a German-style continental imperial power expanding on the continent. That in fact, for Japan as a maritime power, to expand on the continent was a huge mistake because Japan's a naval power and the ocean is its friend. And so that debate was there. And the internationalists and the Navy and the merchants who were arguing that lost, obviously. And the army and the imperialists and the nationalists and the racists dominated. And we in the United States had a small role in that, by the way, because we did things to reinforce it. But Japan was at a crossroads. So I also wanted to make it clear that Abe's vision of a Japan that was more active was based entirely on that earlier maritime, cosmopolitan, Anglo-American, commercial rules obeying internationalist vision that Japan abandoned. Which gets to the Aso phrase. Aso was deputy prime minister, kind of a funny, wisecracking political leader, was prime minister briefly. I've known him forever. He actually told me that when we were drinking, and then I wrote him and asked if I could quote it. But he said that, and many Japanese historians have argued that half of it, that Japan's biggest mistake as a maritime power was trying to fight a war of conquest on the continent. If you think about American history, Vietnam, perfect example. What were we thinking? We're a maritime power. How did we send 600,000 troops to a land war in Asia? So it's a mistake for a maritime. If you've seen the movie The Princess Bride, and maybe your professor's the only one old enough to remember that famous line, never fight a major land war in Asia. Sorry, 80s movie reference. So Aso was saying Japan made a huge mistake. Many Japanese historians acknowledge this, trying to expand on the continent. China is a continental power. It's never had a significant maritime strategy. Briefly, in the 1400s, a fleet traveled around the world, and then they burned the ships and abandoned the whole idea of a navy. So China is a continental power, and trying to take on maritime powers like the United States and Australia and Japan and India and Britain, he's saying it's going to be a folly for China. That's what he was getting at. The professor froze. Is that me or is that?
He did freeze.
It's not me. So if you guys, while he reboots, if somebody wants to jump in and ask a question, I also have the chat. Oh, there's a question in the chat I'll go to what extent are possible revanchist intentions from China for World War II influence current Japanese strategy? China seems no longer to tolerate its former status as a victim. So part of Abe's approach to China was based on the idea that China could not simultaneously claim it was a victim of Japan while expanding at Japan's expense. And he wanted to reset that history question with China as well. And the way he did it was in 2015, on the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II, he issued a major statement. On the 10-year anniversaries of the end of the war in 1945, August 1945, Japanese prime ministers have, since the Cold War, end of the Cold War, issued statements reflecting, apologizing, usually very brief, fiercely debated. Abe wanted to put out a statement on the 70th anniversary that would not be reticent, that would be fulsome. He put out the longest statement with the most extensive apology. He consulted with Australian, American, and Southeast Asian counterparts to include things that mattered to them. He did not do that with China and Korea. And the reason was he felt, and not entirely without reason, that China in particular, and sometimes Korea, manipulated for political reasons Japan's war guilt. And he didn't want them to do that. So his strategy was to get the Americans, the Australians, the Indonesians, Europeans to accept and welcome his apology. And they did. And in exchange, he told the Chinese and Koreans, that's the last apology we're doing. Now, that revisionist approach, as some would call it, didn't sit well, and yet it worked. The apology was accepted by enough of the world that it situated Japan strategically well. It still leaves Korea, and the Korea-Japan relationship is hugely complicated by the history of what Japan did to Korea, and court cases and things in Korea that continually come up that remind the Koreans of what they had to endure under Japanese occupation, but also say to the Japanese, this will never be solved with these Koreans. These court cases are never ending. So they're a bit stuck. Now, the question about Chinese revanchism, I'm not sure if this is what you're getting at, but it is really interesting and worth watching. The Japanese and the Chinese look at the post-war order and they go back to different documents from 75 years ago. The Chinese point to the Yalta and Potsdam agreements, Roosevelt and Truman, when China and the US were on the same side fighting Japan. And the Americans promised China would be one of the four policemen, one of the major upholders of order, and Japan would be an out nation. And so when China makes claims to the Diaoyu, the Senkaku Islands, or says that Japan is essentially not a fully legitimate international player, it's pointing to the World War II joint statements and agreements when China was run by the nationalists, by Chiang Kai-shek, was on the US side against Japan. But those agreements also shaped post-war order to some extent. The Japanese point to San Francisco, 1951, when the US, during the Korean War, when China was our enemy, signed a peace treaty with Japan, security treaty with Japan. And that is how the Japanese reference their territorial claims. So the Chinese and Japanese point to completely different historical documents, which American presidents and American governments signed with absolutely no sense of irony on our part. In 1945, 44, 45, China was on our side, Japan was the enemy. 1951, Japan was on our side, China was the enemy. So each of them have a target-rich environment to go back to historical statements by the US. It's interesting how much they point to the Americans as sources of legitimacy. The current US policy is that the 1951 Security Treaty and Peace Treaty supersede, and in fact are treaties, and they're ratified by the Senate and legally binding, that they supersede the Yalta, Potsdam, World War II statements that FDR often negotiated on his own, or Truman. But the Chinese don't see it that way. So when you talk about revanchism, there's a completely different interpretation of post-war order in Tokyo and Beijing that will never be resolved. That's partly of our doing, because Americans don't have much of a sense of irony or history in our foreign policy.
Sorry about that. I had some internet issues
No.
on this line on my side. There was a question about the Quad, and you had talked about external balancing and the importance of the Quad as an institutional architecture. So some of the questions are about what would be necessary to further institutionalize the Quad to make it into a more effective organization. Is that realistic from your perspective? What would it take to kind of become a true alliance, given those ideological differences between some of the members of the alliance and India's own hesitation traditionally, historically? Do you think that it's likely that Japan might join something like the AUKUS relationship in the next few years, or is that still going to be limited by Article 9, joining that kind of a sort of defense-oriented?
These are great questions. And looking at the pace of change in Japanese strategy and national security over the last 15 years, I'd say you're safe betting that a lot of what you just asked about will happen. And to me, the first piece of evidence is the 20th Party Congress that just happened in Beijing. This was not a Xi Jinping who said, you know what, I've been a little harsh on you, rest of the world. I'm just going to sort of become a nice guy now. I'm sorry. That was not what we saw. We saw, I mean, the vision of Hu Jintao being escorted off the stage, the promotions to the Standing Committee of the Politburo of the most nationalistic hardliners, the retirement of Ye and others who were thought of as reformers. I mean, we've got 10, 15, maybe 20 years of Xi Jinping hardline policies. So that's the structural factor, it's agency, but that's the reality that the US, Australia, Japan, and India face. And I think that you're going to continue seeing, therefore, hardline pressure on India, including violence in the Himalayas, more Chinese building of military ports in the Indian Ocean, pressure on Australia, pressure on Japan. So the Quad, the logic of the Quad will continue. I would look in the next 5 to 10 years for the possibility of, right now the Quad is focusing on things to help Asia, producing vaccines and so forth. I would look in the future at a standing naval task force where you have quad ships regularly patrolling together and things like that. That said, it's not going to be NATO. It's very different. So the US and Australia we fought side by side in every major conflict since Illinois National Guard troops went into combat in 1918 under the Australians at the Battle of Hamel, which is famous here in Australia. And we have with Australia the Five Eyes relationship. They're in the most intimate intelligence relationships with Britain and Canada and New Zealand. Japan doesn't have that. On the other hand, Japan has incredibly close security ties to Australia, and any Taiwan contingency or South China Sea contingency is almost certainly going to be the US, Japan, and Australia. That's who's going to show up to the fight. India, probably not. On the other hand, India is a really big country of 1 billion people and an important navy. And so they're going to be really critical to maintaining a balance of power. So it's kind of going to be a la carte. And the institution-wide things may be standing naval task forces, but I wouldn't look for a joint headquarters or anything unless China really gets aggressive. And then I think you'll see that. AUKUS is interesting. It's a US, UK, Australia trilateral agreement to do two things: to help Australia build nuclear-powered submarines, probably 10 or 11 of them, based on US and British design, so that Australia can silently send subs far north to keep the Chinese at bay, frankly. But there's a second pillar to AUKUS, which is called advanced capabilities, hypersonics, quantum. The US is already doing that with Japan bilaterally. So I think in that second area, you will see more Australia, Japan, US cooperation. The Australians and the Japanese need surface-to-surface missiles. It's a big part of Japan's new defense plan, strike capability. And Australia needs strike capability. The Chinese and North Koreans are proliferating missiles. And the other side, whether it's Japan, Korea, Taiwan, need missiles. That's you saw in Ukraine how critical that strike capability is now, and how dangerous it is to be on a destroyer or a frigate or a ship. So people are shifting what goes bang, and the U.S. can't produce enough for all our friends. So I think there's a very real chance that you'll see Japan and Australia, maybe Korea and the U.S., Britain, starting to work over the next few years on ideas for developing these kind of capabilities together. So there's more to follow, but India is going to be the slowest partner, a little behind the curve.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think you're right, Mike. I think you're right in where you see this is headed. We haven't talked yet about the nuclear issue in today's conversation, and there's a couple of questions that came up about this. So the first one, what in your mind would be the sort of triggering events that would provoke Japan to think about pursuing that route? And then maybe more closer to the near term, if the United States were to further extend its nuclear guarantees to Japan or elsewhere in East Asia, Southeast Asia, would that, in your mind, be a force for stability, or that increase the likelihood of war?
So the Japanese people they have a split personality on nuclear weapons. On the one hand, they're the only victims of nuclear war and are deeply committed, in particular Kishida, the current prime minister, to the long-term goal of eliminating nuclear weapons. They cannot abide the idea that there will always be nuclear weapons. It's deeply ingrained in Japanese politics and culture because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On the other hand, no country in the world is more worried about or more influential in the US debate about our nuclear weapons policy. So in the long run, the Japanese are absolutely committed to eliminating nuclear weapons. In the short run, they are absolutely terrified we would do anything to reduce the use of nuclear weapons as an option. So the US just did this major nuclear strategic review. They did one a few years ago. Japan is always the most active lobbying in Washington, saying, don't weaken extended deterrence. Don't weaken the credibility of nuclear weapons, because look where we live, man. The North Koreans are developing nuclear weapons. The Chinese are developing huge numbers of ballistic missiles and clearly looking at tactical uses of nuclear weapons. Look at Putin. By the way, we also live near Russian missiles. So for God's sakes, don't weaken your commitment to defending us with nuclear weapons. And so it's a real, but understandable personality disorder. It's complete schizophrenia. One of the reasons the Japanese government is so adamant, the Japanese people, about US extended deterrence is because they don't want to have to consider nuclear weapons. So the only thing I think that leads to Japan developing nuclear weapons is if the US extended deterrence or nuclear umbrella or guarantee fell apart. But the Japanese will do everything in their power to make sure it doesn't. And my own feeling is that it would be a very different United States that decides it would be a good idea to pull back our nuclear umbrella. Because it would be a much more dangerous world for us. And the Japanese will keep us honest, and they do it quietly, but it's intense, the influence they have. And increasingly the Koreans and the British and the French and others are with them. Should the US extend nuclear guarantees further? Probably not, because, you know, if an extended deterrence, it's a red line. It essentially says, if you attack this country, we might use nuclear weapons on you if you use, we don't say other circumstances. You know, Biden is trying to say we'll only use it as a last resort, but it's basically you're drawing a red line. And if we extend nuclear guarantees to more countries, as my old boss in the White House used to say, if you keep drawing red lines and you don't honor them, you're creating a red carpet for the other side to think you're not serious. So I think extending nuclear guarantees to more countries actually weakens the credibility of our deterrent where it really matters, which would be Japan, Korea, NATO. So I think it won't happen. Would it make war more likely? It depends, but I think it would weaken deterrence. And in the long run, that's not good for stability. So I should probably end there because it's the hour, but also something's wrong with my plug and my battery's about to die.
Excellent. All right. Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Michael Green for doing a great job today. I think this is really terrific. A great talk, and I think, you know, you've raised some poignant observations. I encourage everybody to check out the book. He does a really nice job in there, highlighting the differences between rising Japan in World War II and the current strategy, and identifying where these things are quite different from each other. And I think it's a really, as is always, he's just got a fantastically honed strategic view in mind for these kinds of problems. So we're glad to have you on the circuit, and congratulations on the new book, Mike, and best of luck in Sydney. I hope it's a very productive time.
Thanks very much, and congratulations to everybody here for being Scowcroft Fellows.
Yeah. Thanks much. Take care. Thank you all.